still bushed. Number 3, electrocution gate. We already know that as many as 18 American service personnel have been electrocuted in Iraq, most due to horrifically bad electrical wiring near water pipes done by the Halliburton spinoff KBR. Now comes the still more awful news that in addition to tens of billions of dollars in contracts, KBR also received tens of millions of dollars in bonuses. This will be revealed at a hearing conducted by Senator Dorgan tomorrow. The bonuses were for the electrical wiring KBR did in Iraq. Our men and women have had many mortal enemies there. Saddam's army, the insurgency, and KBR. Only we didn't have to pay Saddam or the insurgency to kill our troops. Number 2, Cheney Gate. The Journal of the Army War College Parameters has reviewed Jane Mayer's new book, The Dark Side. The reviewer, War College professor Jeffrey Record, selects this passage from the book. What made Cheney's influence so perfidious was the combination of his profound panic over the 9/11 attacks and the mysterious anthrax attacks in the following month, and his absolutist view of presidential prerogatives. The attacks apparently unnerved Cheney to the point of his imagining Saddam Hussein to be undeterrable, an al-Qaeda collaborator, and brimming with weapons of mass destruction. I don't know him anymore, said Brent Scowcroft, former national security advisor to George H.W. Bush. According to Lawrence Wilkerson, Powell's chief of staff, Cheney was traumatized by 9/11. The poor guy became paranoid. Having underestimated the al-Qaeda threat before 9/11, Cheney overcompensated. In the weeks following the attacks, he traveled with a doctor, as well as a duffel bag containing a gas mask and a biochemical survival kit. It is easy to psychoanalyze what happens to a man who thinks he knows everything when that which he dismisses as impossible becomes all too real, and it is largely his fault that it became such. And sometimes easy is right. And number 1, now you say it, Gate. A second member of the Bush administration has now revealed misgivings about torture. Sadly, misgivings she did not make public at the time. Karen Hughes, a member of the White House Iraq Study Group from 2002 to 2004, tells the Houston Chronicle, quote, I was very vocal in the internal debate. I worried about how that would make us look in the eyes of the world, but I had left the White House when a lot of that was taking place. Nice. Ms. Hughes indeed left the White House in 2004. She left it so she could go work on Mr. Bush's re-election campaign. After that, she went back to the White House to run Bush's effort to win the hearts and minds of the Middle East. So when was it that you were worried? And when was it that you weren't working for Mr. Bush? And how long did you ignore your conscience and not say anything? And what were you thinking when you left the White House and went back to selling this man to the country and you said, I think after September 11th, the American people are valuing life more and realizing that we need policies to value the dignity and worth of every life. And really the fundamental difference between us and the terror network we fight is that we value every life. Still Bush. Number 3, cooking the books gate. The Inspector General at Homeland Security has finally ruled on a little oopsie in the days when Mr. Bush's people were still trying to make the draconian airport screening process seem effective. The FAA had scheduled a secret test of security at 12 major airports for late April 2006. Oddly enough, just before that test, somebody in the Transportation Security Administration sent out an email warning that at Jacksonville Airport the FAA might be conducting a secret test, and that this is what the officials would look like, and this is how they would be dressed. And so TSA officials should make sure every passenger and ID matched. In other words, Homeland Security made sure Homeland Security would pass the test. Number 2, George Bush, worldwide distributor of Democracy Gate. The new president of Pakistan, Mr. Zardari, has, in an effort to reduce violence and tension between his government and extremists in the area, just signed a law permitting the Taliban to impose Sharia law in a northwestern part of his country. That would be the same Taliban that let village elders in southwestern Afghanistan debate for 2 days the case of a 14-year-old girl and her 17-year-old boyfriend who tried to break her engagement to somebody else by eloping to Iran. Half the town council there wanted to find a way to let the couple marry, so the Taliban stepped in and executed the teenagers. And number 1, tax the poor gate. Former Bush press secretary Ari Fleischer still fighting against mental health. This time writing in the pages of the Murdoch Street Journal under this bizarre headline, everyone should pay income taxes. It's bad for our democracy to exempt half the country. He wrote, it's what's called redistribution of income, and it is getting out of hand. A very small number of taxpayers, the 10% of the country that makes more than $92,400 a year, pay 72.4% of the nation's income taxes. Their burden keeps getting heavier. You know, Ari Fleischer is right. That poor 10% of this country paying nearly 3/4 of all the taxes. It's just not fair to... Wait a minute. Mr. Fleischer has left out some details here about he and I and those other top income makers. Statistics from 2005. The top 1% of the country's wage earners, our share of the total income is about 22%. That's a level not seen since the days of President Calvin Coolidge. The top 10%, which in 2005, by the way, was still people making 100 grand or more, not 92 grand. It makes 48.5% of all the reported income in this country. The top 300,000 American earners, we make as much as the bottom 150 million American earners. Individually, we make 440 times what they make individually. Wait, Ari says, the top 10% earns 48.5% of all the income, but pays 72.4% of all the tax? That's not fair. Actually, it's not. It's more than fair. Because a lot of that bottom 90%, they make nothing at all. And if we raise their taxes, guess what, Ari? They still won't be paying anything. Take it from me, the rich are making out like bandits. And to complain about the relative tax burden is not just offensive and embarrassing, but it taxes something else. Credulity.
Still bushed. Number 3, gated community gate. While he was president, Mr. Bush dismissed the notion that he lived in a bubble, insulated from people and concepts that might challenge him. Approximately 1 month after he left office, one of his new neighbors asked whether she could bring a group of visitors by. She was told no the first and second time, the Washington Post reports. After the third time, she was told yes, but only 30 people could enter the Bush's street. A raffle would pick 2 of the visitors who could actually approach the Bush door. The visitors were Cub Scouts. The oldest of them was 11. Their goal was to collect canned goods for a food drive. Countdown is happy to report the former president survived the encounter. Number 2, Freedom Bush-style gate. A few dispatches from the Bush democracies Americans died and paid for. Just today alone, Amnesty International is calling on Iraqi officials to stop ignoring systematic murders of gay Iraqis. Unsurprisingly, because homosexuality is illegal in Iraq. Also today, the Iraqi army threatened to shut down one newspaper and one TV station, both critics of the Bush-style democratic government. And then there was Afghanistan. Mr. Bush did not get bin Laden, did not destroy al-Qaeda, but at least we were told he got the Taliban, right? This weekend, a leading women's rights activist said farewell to her friends there. She had decided to leave Bush's democracy because it was not safe to pursue her work. But she did not leave. On Saturday, she was shot dead in broad daylight by the Taliban. And number 1, habeas corpus gate. According to the Associated Press, in 2007, the Bush administration deported 31-year-old Pedro Guzman from California to Mexico for being in the United States illegally. Guzman was mentally ill and could not read or write. After his deportation, he slept on the streets, eating from trash cans for almost 3 months. Pedro Guzman is an American citizen. He was born in Los Angeles, California. According to the Associated Press, the Bush administration mistakenly treated other American citizens, mostly Hispanic, as illegal immigrants, especially those unable to defend or adequately express themselves, including the mentally ill, the poor, minorities, people with criminal records, including unpaid traffic tickets, and children. 55 American citizens disappeared from their homes, illegally banished from their homeland. 55 American citizens that we know of. Still bushed. Number 3, business before Peoplegate. Remember Captain Sully Sullenberger landing his plane in the Hudson River after a bird strike crippled his jet? Well, maybe, you're thinking, if the government knew how prevalent bird strikes were, the government and private industry could look into new measures to mitigate the problem. Turns out NASA did an $11 million study interviewing 30,000 pilots between 2001 and 2004 about safety issues, and then killed the study without ever revealing what the pilots told them. According to the Government Accountability Office, one thing that killed the study was resistance from the Federal Aviation Administration, which claimed pilot answers were subjective, which should have been obvious. But then there's this. In 2007, the Associated Press reported that one reason NASA killed the study was because the results, which we still do not know, might have hurt airline profits, as if landing in the Hudson would not. Number 2, business before people, the sequel gate. For years, critics of the Bush administration have been howling that he let big business essentially run all the regulatory agencies that were supposed to protect Americans from the damaging excesses of corporate greed. Nowhere has that been more apparent than the Food and Drug Administration. But today we know the problem wasn't just peanuts. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention report that U.S. efforts to reduce the number of foodborne illnesses essentially stalled 3 years ago, and that some illnesses are now on the increase. The GAO found last year that the Bush FDA did not even have a formal setup for inspecting fresh produce, even as fresh produce became a bigger source of foodborne illness. Of all the fresh produce imported to the U.S. between 2002 and 2007, the Bush FDA inspected approximately 1%. And number one, the revenge of business before Peoplegate. When Mr. Bush allowed polluters to pollute on the honor system, it was to save you, the taxpayer, the financial burdens that would surely be passed on to you if polluters were forced to pay for their pollution. The Bush Republicans remaining in office are still using that argument to call President Obama's pollution fees a tax on you. Doing nothing about global warming gases is actually cheaper for you, the consumer, they say. Except they never seem to mention that doing nothing has its own cost. Consider one small part of the economy, corn. Its optimum temperature range is 64 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. So global warming will actually make the growing season longer. But a new report from the advocacy group Environment America says that projected global warming increases that push the temperature above 72 degrees will have an overall negative effect on corn crops. How negative? $1.4 billion every year. See if you can find that tax listed in the Bush Republicans' budget.